This is Blood and Cancer, the official podcast of MDedge Hematology/Oncology, where we discuss the latest research, treatment considerations, and other issues related to hematology and oncology. Welcome to this podcast. I'm your host, Dr. David Henry, and you're listening to Blood and Cancer, interviewing today Annie Ellis, who is a cancer survivor. We'll explore with her the GYN cancer she's been involved with, her advocacy, and her research in this area. So, Annie, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Henry. I'm so delighted to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you because, as we did before going on our recording, I mentioned to you I see patients with all sorts of malignancy, and I think I know what it's like, but I tell them there's no way I can know what it's like except people who've been there, done that. And the courage and dedication and just commitment our patients make to getting through this is really something only another patient can tell. So in brief, I know it's public knowledge, but if you want to mention you were diagnosed way back when, and you've been through a couple speed bumps along the way, and then we'll get into advocacy and clinical trials. So what was your story from then to now?
Oh, yeah. So I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2004 at the age of 40. And I experienced in the first 3.5 years, 2 recurrences, 5 different treatment regimens. I had, 3 major surgeries, and the last one was a partial liver resection. And I also participated in a phase 1 remission vaccine clinical trial. I became interested in clinical trials as a way to expand my treatment options. And that also opened doors to research advocacy.
Well, let's go. So, of course, as a patient, you've been there and been through it to know what it's like and some of the do's and don'ts of being a patient and, of course, interacting with your caregivers. And I'd then like to go right to your research, whom you did with your colleague, Dicey Scroggins. You're a secretary in a law firm in a previous life, and you took that skill and knowledge and morphed it into what you've done today. And you actually had a poster in the March 2020 SGO Society Gynecological Organization. And I thought it was so interesting because clinical trials, it's embarrassing that in pediatrics, it's maybe 90% of children go on clinical trials and make progress for curing those cancers. And we do about 3% in adult. And I'll give my lame excuses in a second why I'm probably just as bad. But you, in your poster with Dicey, went through why people are or are not on clinical trials. So can you maybe list what you found?
Yeah, we were really interested in quantifying the patient voice and why people participate or don't participate in clinical trials. Because we hear all the time about why, that people don't, and then why certain populations might not, participate in clinical trial because of, historical mistrust or anything like that. But what we found was that, people participate or don't participate. It seems to be whether or not their doctor asks them. So about, we had a number of people who didn't participate, and about half of them did not have a clinical trial discussion with their medical team. Yet 80%, over 80% of the people who did participate in a clinical trial learned about the trial from their doctor. And so we thought, the implications for that were if there were just more discussions, perhaps more doors would open. Now, of course, there are other reasons for not participating. The usual that we hear that people don't.
Well, as you're about to list them, tell the study was how many people, where'd you do it, and how'd you get these people?
Okay, yeah. So we did an online survey that was distributed through, the internet and social media groups. We had 28 questions, including a lot of demographics. We ended up with 189 responses. So it was, quite, it was a pilot study for us to just kind of get some preliminary information back. And about a third of the participants, 34%, had participated in a clinical trial, and the rest had not participated in a clinical trial.
Okay. All right. So then go ahead. The most interesting, I think, of all is the one you listed first, which is it didn't come up. Um, I'll throw myself on my sword and say I sadly do this from time to time, only because the clinical visits tend to be involving so much else. How are you feeling? How are you doing? What do my scans show? How's my chemo working? What's my next step? And then is there time the clinician thinks of or the patient thinks of clinical trial? So that was the number one missed opportunity, yes?
It appears so. It appears so. And I think when I think back to my own personal experience with this, I was I, I had heard about this vaccine clinical trial to extend remissions in a support group, and I found it sounded very interesting to me. My fellow patient was, not interested. She thought it was, the consent form scared her. But as I was kind of flipping through it, she shared, the information with the group. I was thinking, oh my gosh, this sounds cool. I want a piece of that. And so I went to this doctor to see if I could get into this clinical trial without letting my primary oncologist know. I did not qualify for this particular trial. And when I went back and told my doctor, I kind of, it felt like I was, cheating on my lover or
Yeah,
something
yeah, yeah,
because,
yeah. Going around them.
exactly. I mean, here's a man who saved my life, and I'm going to go see this other man, or this other doctor. But when I came clean, when I mentioned this to him, he said, "Oh, I didn't know you were interested in clinical trials. Had I known, that's who I would have sent you to."
Huh,
So,
interesting.
it's interesting that we get to a point where we seek things out on our own, and
Yes.
and different institutions have different levels of what's available there, and so that could be a factor as well.
Well, I thought I made notes of some that you found on your poster and your database survey. I don't want placebo, logistics, location, so it might be inconvenient. Um, I don't want experimental therapy. I think it's a great fear. If it's clinical trial, it must be experimental. I try to remind my patients every drug I give you at one point was on a clinical trial, so we need to pick and choose. Insurance does not cover is a misconception. I don't trust the medical system. That's a good one. And I think several of these come up from time to time. Um, can you comment on that a bit? Still, the number one is if it's not offered, you can never even come up with the other answers.
Yeah, and if I can quote my colleague Dicey Scroggins on this, what she likes to say is patients can't go to the party if they don't get an invitation.
Yeah.
Clinical trials are something that you need to know about, and you need almost an invitation to get to. The Unger reports that came out in 2019 and late last year kind of talk a lot about structural and clinical barriers, that are in place even before you get to the patient barriers. And so not having a clinical trial nearby, not qualifying, these are things that are not within the patient's control. Things that are within the patient's control, whether or not they want to be randomized, or if they think they might get a placebo. I have been giving peer support in the GYN space for over a decade, and I know that when I speak with patients who are considering a clinical trial and are very resistant or just don't want anything to do with them, it takes about 3 conversations to kind of explain how clinical trials work, explain the safety involved, explain that in cancer clinical trials, the placebos are only given if no treatment is the standard of care. That no, either they will get the standard drug plus something else, or they would get a standard drug plus a placebo, or it's observation, or those types of conditions. But it would normally
Therein lies, I think we could just go with that a minute, the problem. I like your metaphor. If you can't go to the party, you don't get an invitation. So you've been at many interactions with caregivers, and you've been there to discuss how you're doing, symptom management, next treatment, so forth. Was there always time that could have, should have been used to talk about a clinical trial, or is it just not appropriate every visit?
there's not time in every visit. My personal opinion, as a patient and as someone who gives peer support, is that at decision treatment appointments. I would love if every cancer survivor or someone, who's dealing with cancer could be offered a clinical trial, or consider a clinical trial. I don't believe that every trial is right for everybody, but I think, if there is something available, or at least to have that conversation, would be the ideal. And we know that there's not time. The reason why some of us are very busy in that peer support space is because we often find that patients may only have 10 to 15 minutes, at a treatment change appointment to make that decision. And a lot of times that's not enough for them to really comprehend and between their choices, especially in the recurrent space. In frontline treatment, a lot of standard of care is the guidelines are out there, and pretty much, at least in some spaces, here are the list of what we do frontline, and this is what you get. When you get into the recurrent space, there's a lot more patient involvement in the decision, and sometimes patients don't feel qualified to participate. I know I didn't. We talk about PhD as, personal history of disease, where we don't even understand the terminology sometimes. So how can we really have consent if we don't understand what our options are? And
Well, I think you really hit the problem. So there's so much going on at every clinic visit. They're not very long, 10, 15, 20 minutes sometimes. And at decision point, second, third, fourth line, yes, that's the time, but it isn't happening. You and Dicey must have thought about this a lot. What could we do as clinicians, you advising us as an advocate and survivor, to make sure this conversation does happen, prep our patients? A lot of what you just said, what's a placebo control versus observation? What kind, there's experimental phase 1, there's experimental phase 3, very different. And so how could our patients be prepped for this better than they are?
Well, I know a lot of institutions who are, at cancer centers, and also a lot of advocacy organizations have videos and literature and education materials on clinical trials, as well as patients who've gone through clinical trials talking about it. And I think connecting with those types of resources to help fill in the gaps for the time and information that you just don't have time to give at a meeting would be helpful. And not waiting. I think hearing that, especially if someone's managing a chronic type of cancer long term, hearing those words, a clinical trial as an option, might be helpful. And we do hear one thing that was really interesting in the data that we collected from our respondents was that the number one reason for not participating in a clinical trial was because the conversation wasn't happening. But the second most common one was other. It was a fill in the blank. Here's this other thing. And about half of those responses in the other category were things like, I have no evidence of disease, the standard treatments worked, so I don't need a clinical trial. And other, assertions that, I just didn't need a clinical trial. And so I think that having a conversation about this is what, this is the standard of care, this is what we're going to do now, and, leaving the door that clinical trials is, always an option, might be just a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'm thinking as you're talking, I at the University of Pennsylvania at a affiliate hospital where we do clinical trials. And, I would love it if at a research meeting each week, the coordinator said, our phone's ringing off the hook. People are calling saying, what do you have for this, that, and the other? Of course, that doesn't happen. And we're tasked appropriately to go out into the community and give talks to various patient types to make awareness at community advisory boards, advocacy groups, wherever we can, to clinicians to keep awareness. So I'm just thinking on what a wonderful service you provide to be such an advocate and to help us be sure that phone rings more, if not off the hook, of aware patients prior to or just after, if not during, those very brief visits, which are so focused on symptom and response and next step in clinical trial. I sometimes see a patient screw up their face a bit or with someone else. Like when I raise clinical trial, oh, I'm doing that badly. It's come to that, has it? I got to do experimental. And, there comes the conversation. Sometimes it is phase one if it's far out in your disease, but sometimes it's, I have an anemia trial, for example, with a pill that looks to be spectacular. And I go, gee, this really could help you. All drugs are on clinical trials first. So other things in our discussion before we conclude on how to get that phone ringing off the hook, what have you found works?
The one thing I do want that caught our eye also was that of the people who did participate in the clinical trial, 100% of the participants answered either, yes, I would participate again, or that they were unsure whether they would participate. So about 84% would participate and 15% were unsure. No one said that they would not participate again. And so, or prefer not
Really?
to answer. Yeah, so that indicates to us that clinical trial participation, was, something that
It was a positive
a
experience.
positive experience. And even if they didn't get the result that they wanted, again, we were looking at the comments to kind of correlate who said what, that they were still open to doing it again. And I think that's really significant that, and especially in the, again, I'm coming from a recurrent ovarian cancer space, a lot of people use clinical trials as a way to expand their treatment options.
Were you in a clinical trial?
I was in a phase one clinical trial as part of my third line of treatment.
And what was your experience? Was it a good or a bad? I mean, there's always the drug or the therapy, but the way you were handled as well.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I went to a survivor conference early on in my survival, and one of the things the presenter said was, ladies, please consider clinical trials earlier rather than later in your, treatment journey, because you're going to qualify for more treatment, more trials, earlier. And then as you get more treatment, you qualify for fewer trials. If the trial drug doesn't work, the standard approved drugs are still going to be there for you. And so that was something that really was helpful to me in, prioritizing clinical trial participation. Once I was in the trial, it was a phase one remission vaccine. So it was kind of, I had already completed treatment and I had no evidence of disease, but I can tell you that walking into the door and it said experimental treatment center. So that was a little unnerving because it reminds you this is an experiment, but I felt so well cared for. I felt they were watching everything and that I was going to be taken care of. And
I think that is true. I tell patients that I say, you just caused me a lot of headache. They go, what do you mean? After they sign the clinical trial, I say, well, now there's 50 or some number of physicians, caregivers, scientists watching over my shoulder to be sure I do exactly the right thing by you for the trial. And of course, good trials never trump good medical care. So I have to show I'm doing all that. And I think you found this is largely true. Yes, clinical trial care is excellent.
Yes. And I always let that, the patients that I'm pairing with know that they're in the driver's seat. Make sure that you understand that the consent is not just a form that you sign, it's a process, it's a dialogue. And at the end of the day, you can withdraw for any reason at any time. And even though we don't go into that with that intention, knowing that that's my safety check, or I have a parachute if I want to jump out of the plane. It is a very important aspect to it that I do have some control.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I often mention that you'll see kind of a worry on the patient or the CW other's face as they're looking for the bottom page and going to sign. I say, listen, this is your consent. It's not a contract. You can withdraw your consent 5 minutes from now. We hope you won't because of everything we've discussed, but just as you said, that's your safety net, your parachute. Well, I can't tell you how much I enjoy speaking with you, Annie, and anything else you'd like to mention as we hope our audience will redouble their efforts to involve their patients with clinical trials just like you.
Yeah, I think, we talk a lot about those barriers, and, the randomization we can't change because we need that for good science, and research advocates understand that. But what we can change is asking more people to the party. Whether you think, don't make assumptions. Don't, because someone's either elderly or lives further, or, let them decide whether the clinical trial is right for them. But, I think having the option and getting the options earlier rather than later might help open minds.
Well, I think that'll be our buzz phrase, which is get yourself invited to the party, and to our listeners, invite more people to the party. Well, I want to thank you, Annie. I'm speaking with Annie Ellis and her colleague who joined her on this poster, which was at SGO last year on Dicey Scroggins. For both of you and the work you do and for your cancer survivorship and for taking the time to speak with us today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Henry.
Blood and Cancer is produced by MDedge. Our editor is Jen Smith. All MDedge podcasts are produced by executive editor Kathy Scarbeck, and I'm your host, Dr. David Henry.